Okay, good morning, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parashat Vayakhel, which literally means to gather. Moses gathered the people together. We'll talk about the topic of discussion in a moment, but this is the next to last Torah portion in the second book of Moses, the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot. This Parsha, along with next week's Parsha, next week's Torah portion, and really those of the last few weeks, discuss primarily all the various details regarding the construction and the inauguration of the Mishkan. The Mishkan is literally translated as the tabernacle. It was the portable sanctuary that accompanied the Jewish people in their journeys in the desert. What's interesting about this week's portion is that the topic of discussion is at the very beginning of the portion of the Parsha, not about the tabernacle, but actually about the Sabbath. We're told, in paraphrasing the first few verses, that Moses spoke to the Jewish people and said to them, this is the matter that God has commanded, and he starts talking about Sabbath observance, and then thereafter, in the next portion, the next few verses rather, he gets back to the detail of the tabernacle, the construction and the inauguration of the tabernacle. So the question, what's the connection here? So the connection, as understood in rabbinic tradition, based upon the wording of the verse, is that we're in effect being told that there were really two tabernacles that we Jewish people have had in our history. We have the tabernacle, which of course was, as I said, this portable sanctuary. Later on it was replaced by the permanent sanctuary known as the temple, right? Beit HaMikdash. And that refers to a spatial structure. In other words, the idea is that God instructed the Jewish people to provide him with some type of a physical space in this world whereby people could appreciate and come to know, I guess in a very tangible way, about his presence. In addition to that though, there is a sanctuary known as perhaps a time-bound sanctuary, and that really refers to the Sabbath. And it's very interesting. You look throughout our history, we have obviously existed as a people for thousands of years, not only without a tabernacle, but without a temple, without having a physical reminder of God's presence, right? But we have not existed, certainly not since the revelation at Mount Sinai, which took place a little before this week's portion, is chronologically, we have not existed without the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, again, is meant to provide us with a time frame, a weekly time frame through which we could learn to appreciate God's presence, God's existence. And one of the great Hebrew authors who lived, comparatively speaking, in recent times, someone known as Echad Ha'am, famously made the comment, he said, more so than the Jews have kept the Sabbath, which was of course a cornerstone of our tradition, he said really the Sabbath has kept the Jews. And there's something about the Sabbath, there's something about having a weekly opportunity to recharge our batteries spiritually, to reconnect Jewishly, that really is considered very, very important to our existence. So, number one, I would say we certainly see from here the importance of the Sabbath, and I'd make a plea to, if possible, make the Sabbath, a meaningful part of your weekly routine. It's an important way to connect, in whatever way appropriate, by the way. We're not, obviously not going to get into the specifics. Okay, so that's the Sabbath. By the way, it's not meant to be a monologue. Certainly not meant to put people to sleep. Any questions, any comments, I welcome them. Okay? All right. The Torah goes on in describing some of the various items that were used in the construction of the tabernacle, not only the tabernacle, but also the various attendant utensils. We have the altar, we have the menorah, of course, we have a laver. In addition to that, we also have the garments worn by the Kohanim, the priests, right? the standard ordinary priest, as they're referred to, and the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And the Torah indicates later on in the narrative that the princes of the tribes brought some precious stones which were used on the breastplate of the high priest. Many of us may be familiar with the fact, if we've seen pictures, diagrams of it, there were stones in the breastplate of the high priest, stones that correspond to each of the 12 tribes. And these stones, we're told, were very, very expensive. And they were provided, as I said, by the princes, but yet the Torah, in writing, in recording this, wrote the term priest in a way that is considered defective. There are certain letters that are usually incorporated in Hebrew that take the place of vowels. Obviously, even some elementary Hebrew know that we have letters and we have vowels, unlike in English, right? The vowels are usually dots, dashes, whatever, under or on top of the letters, right? Sometimes after the letters. And occasionally we have a letter, for instance, the letter Yud, if you're familiar with that, the 10th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is actually the smallest of the letters, which very often is included in a word to give us some idea of pronunciation. So it's a consonant that really takes the place of a vowel. When the word princes rather is used in this week's portion, it's written defectively. It's written without that letter. And the question is why, right? We believe that the Torah was written, transcribed directly from God's Word. So nothing in there is haphazard. We don't have any copyist error. We don't have any typist error. So why was that? So we have a tradition that tells us that the princes of the tribes said the following. He said, to Moses, when Moses began his appeal, by the way, the very first appeal in Jewish history that we have for religious causes, for a Jewish cause, is recorded right after, well, according to chronologically, it's probably right after the events of the golden calf, when God forgave the people, when people were requested to provide funds and precious materials for the construction of the tabernacle and all these various other attendant items. When that happened, the priest said to Moses, they said, listen, we're wealthy, we're well-to-do people. We're going to let the people contribute whatever amount of money they want, right? And whatever gap is left, whatever deficit is left between what they've contributed and what you need, we'll provide for, right? Seems very generous, doesn't it? The only problem is they didn't reckon with the fact that the Jewish people, within the course of one day, provided so much material for the construction of the tabernacle that not only was there not a need for anything else, but they actually took some of those materials and funds and put them on reserve for the upkeep of the tabernacle. So the princes, realizing that they had lost a unique opportunity, said to Moses, listen, we missed out on the construction of the tabernacle. When it comes to providing those precious stones for the high priest, we're not going to wait. We want to be the first ones out there, and they did so. But because, and again, the way it's put in Jewish tradition, because they were somewhat lax, actually the word that's used is lazy, in their offer of funds for the tabernacle, so they are, I don't want to say punished, they are somehow referred to in some way that's less than complimentary by having this defective title used, this defective term used. Very interesting idea. So the question is, what is it though that they did wrong, if we think about it, right? I mean, my major task here is not fundraising, but I can just tell you from my colleagues here and in previous institutions how much we would love to have. What do they call them? A sugar daddy, right? Contribute. Let everyone contribute, and we'll make up the shortfall. Well, but that's a great thing. What's the problem here, right? Exactly. What's the problem? So, when we deal, of course, with the text here, we're dealing with attitudes. We're not dealing so much with actions. The actions were laudable, but the attitudes were a problem. In order to understand this, I think we have to delve into Jewish mystical tradition. No, we're not going to learn how to create a pseudo-human being, a golem. We're not doing that today. That's next week if you want to come. Not today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that in the Kabbalistic, in the mystical Jewish tradition, every human being, certainly every Jew in this context, but every human being has really two different aspects to his or her personality. We have something that's known as a Ratzon Elyon, a higher will, and something known as a Ratzon Tachton, a lower will. The higher will is this instinctive, inspirational sense that I believe every human being gets under certain circumstances. And by contrast, the lower will, what's called the Ratzon Tachton, is more pragmatic, right? Very plodding. Now, if you think about it, right, many of the very, very important decisions that are made in human life, I'm talking, about faith, marriage, choice of profession, perhaps financial decisions, acts of genius, right? Very often they are made seemingly on the spur of the moment, right? You used to have this advertisement when I was younger, I won't tell you how many centuries ago that was, to talk about how it is that a student finally, got the idea, the light bulb went off in his or her head. And remember that imagery, right? We all have that sense that at a certain time that happens, right? There's something that makes sense, something that connects, and we know to go for it, right? That's the way we react certain times. Other times, we have to plod along. We have to be pragmatic. We have to think of the pluses and minuses, right? The benefits, right? And the downside to whatever it is we're going to do. When it comes to issues of spirituality, what's supposed to happen is that our higher will, our Ratzon Elyon, is supposed to take over. That, I think, really helps to crystallize what the issue is with the princes. Yeah, the princes had a wonderful rationalization. They had it all figured out. We're going to step back. We're going to let the common folk, right? The lower class, at least financial class, right? People contribute to either one. They're not going to be able to give everything that's necessary. We'll come in graciously right at the end and provide our piece. Well, that's very nice, but you know what? You're lacking, and taking such an approach, a person shows a lack of consideration, lack of connection with, a lack of zeal in fulfilling, right, this desire of God to make sure that this beautiful temporary sanctuary, this tabernacle, is built. That was the issue. That was what the problem was. They didn't act with that appropriate sense of alacrity, right, of real, this is who I am. As I said, just as I think to me probably the one that resonates well with me is marriage, right? You know that you have the right person when the time comes. It clicks. Doesn't mean necessarily you sit down and plod and go through a checklist, right, of every item here. Probably not. Probably not. It usually doesn't work like that, right? Maybe I'm assuming wrong, but that's my assumption, right? Similarly, when it comes to our connection to spirituality with God, it's supposed to click. It's supposed to be part of us, part of our essence, part of who we are. Now, the mystics, by the way, point out that when we talk about this dichotomy here, right? This disconnect sort of between our lower will, our more pragmatic will, and our more inspired will, right? The higher will. They point out that only in one instance do you find a complete unity between those two approaches, and that, of course, is God. That will eventually become our lot, we believe, in the Messianic era. Until then, we have this little tug of war there. Now, I have to emphasize, by the way, there has to be some type of an interplay here, because very often we can be inspired to do things that turn out not to be right. You've got to be real careful with this. But the idea is that this evidently is part of that overall, puzzle, part of understanding, that complexity, right, of human spiritual makeup. And I think that was a very interesting approach. We find, by the way, the very same idea with regard to the person who is really credited as being the main architect of the tabernacle, somebody named Bezalel. Moshe says something very strange, or out of sync in this week's portion, right? When he has a conversation with Bezalel, who was rather young at the time, by the way, right? So he says at one point in our portion this week, he says, Moses said to the Jewish people, "See that God has proclaimed Bezalel, this individual, gives his lineage by name, right? And that he's the one that I have filled with all kinds of godly wisdom." I meaning God, right? Moses talking in God's name. What is he supposed to see? What is everyone supposed to see? Well, if we take a look and we see that Moses also, of course, announced the anointment, right? Appointment and anointment of the high priest. It was his brother Aaron, right? And those and his progeny. Moses doesn't say that people see that Aaron has been appointed to this high position. Why? Because Bezalel was someone who was possessed, right, of this intuitive sense of what's right, of what's good, and who acted immediately in that area, right? He didn't, in other words, plod along and say, well, let's see, God wants that. No, he threw himself into the task, right, with a great deal of commitment, all based upon this idea that I've got this inspiration. I got to go with it. So we see it actually, as I say, twice in this week's portion. Once in a positive sense and once in a negative sense. All right. Any questions? All right. I wanted to conclude with something that I think also is very interesting. I want to point out that in this week's portion, talking about Bezalel, who we just mentioned, right? When Moses again gets the attention of the people and says, "See that God has appointed Bezalel," it says the following. See that God has filled Bezalel with godly spirit, with all kinds of wisdom and insight and knowledge. Mostly had some real basic understandings of the inner workings of creation, some mystical understandings, all that. And then it goes on and says, and by the way, he also was filled with wisdom of every craft. He knew how to work with gold and silver and copper and stone cutting, etc. All right, that's what it says. Now, the obvious question that presents itself is, if you're telling me at the beginning that, Bezalel had all this mystical understanding about creation, I really don't need to know that he was also capable as a goldsmith or a silversmith, right, or a coppersmith, right? Really doesn't seem to make sense. So again, I emphasize, by the way, I'm dealing here with the underlying concept. Some of these, remember, the political situation that we're going to talk about was very different than now, and I want to keep that in mind because it might be somewhat surprising. I want to fill us in. I want us to zero in on some recent Jewish history. This is actually pre-Shoah, pre-Holocaust history. One of the major centers of Jewish religious academic scholarship in Europe in the pre-war era was a city in, well, actually depending upon which year you're talking about, it alternated between Poland and Lithuania and other countries. City known in Hebrew or Yiddish as Brisk, and known in our language more prominently as Brest-Litovsk. Have you ever heard of that city? There was a treaty that was signed there between the Germans and the then Soviets, and it was the center of a yeshiva. I quote someone who was a skion to that part of that family, rabbinic family, that actually served as the head of that yeshiva, Rabbi Soloveitchik, of blessed memory, was my teacher. He was the professor of Talmud, really in many ways the guiding light of Yeshiva University and the Rabbinical Council of America, so a rabbinic organization I belong to. He had a PhD in philosophy, and he was certainly a top-notch Torah scholar. During the pre-war years, and this is something that many times we don't keep in focus because very appropriately we are focused upon these horrible, unimaginable events of the Holocaust, is in the year 1936. So this was before the Second World War broke out. The Nazis were already in power in Germany, right? But they had not so in Poland. This was in Poland. There was a pogrom that was unleashed against the Jews, and we won't talk about how many were killed. Many were killed. What provoked this pogrom? There was a butcher in Brisk who, according to some views, was not the brightest person, which is also somewhat scary because really there are all kinds of requirements in Jewish law for someone to be a butcher and to really know his stuff, not only in terms of his craft, but to know Jewish law. We won't go there. But but certainly was a Jewish butcher. He got into a scuffle with a policeman, and this policeman was a notorious anti-Semite, so you can only imagine what precipitated it. And something happened that was horrible, and that is that the butcher, in a fit of anger, struck and murdered this policeman. The next day, there was a pogrom in the city that was on a Friday night, and they broke the windows of Jewish homes. They broke the synagogues. Again, if you can, unfortunately, conjure up in your mind some of the imagery we think of in the Holocaust, starting with Kristallnacht and going on. This is what happened in Brisk. Okay? All right. One rabbi who I knew, not well, but knew from New York, he was the head of a yeshiva in New York, someone named Rabbi Sheps, head of a yeshiva in Brooklyn known as Torah Vadas. That means that resonates with you. He was a youngster in Brisk at this time. And he was present when Rabbi Soloveitchik's uncle, Rabbi Yitzchak Zev, usually referred to by his Yiddish name, Rav Velvela Soloveitchik, was approached by some prominent individuals in the community. These individuals said that we want to put together a fund to provide for the families of the victims, right, of this pogrom, and we want you to sign off on it as the rabbi of the city. Now, this Rabbi Shepser was a young, he was in his teens, I'm in early 20s then, Rabbi was was older then, obviously, as was other people, so we just kept his place, kept his counsel, and listened. And they had this discussion, and Rabbi Soloveitchik, put them off with one excuse after another and said, no, he said, at this point, I'm not really prepared to sign on. So these prominent members of the community left, not very happy. So Rabbi Shep said to him afterwards, he says, Rebbe in Hebrew. My rabbi said, I don't understand. So how can there be any more worthy goal, worthy tzedakah, right, worthy charity than providing for these victims of the program? What could possibly be wrong with that? Why would you not want to sign off? So Rabbi Soloveitchik said, it used to be that none of these charities would be able to get off the ground without the active support of the rabbi. He says that's not true these days. He says, as a matter of fact, these days, if a rabbi supports a given charity, it's only because he's been threatened with his job if he doesn't do so. Gave some type of an excuse like that. But then the matter rested. Nothing, and he didn't discuss it. Rabbi didn't want to discuss it further. You got to know this. We've also had great rabbis as teachers. You got to know where and when to, push the envelope and when to, step back and hold your counsel. Well, it happened 4 months later, that Rabbi Soloveitchik received a visit, and I'll tell you about it in a moment. And he immediately asked one of his attendants, go find this Rabbi Sheps, who wasn't a rabbi at this time, right? Go find him, bring him over here. I want him to hear this. Well, a woman who had been widowed because her husband was killed in this pogrom, came and said, I have 7 children. I do not have, was it grush or whatever the exact kopek, I think it might have been, to my name. Don't have a dime to my name. And I want you to know I've approached these people on this council, and they won't give me any money, and I know other people who they won't give any money to either in a similar situation. And Rabbi Soloveitchik pointed out to this young man, this Rabbi Sheps at the time, and said, now you understand why I didn't want to give them money. Because there was something about the way they presented themselves and what I knew about them that gave me a good reason to believe that these people were not honest and they were taking the money for themselves. Now, this is so far a beautiful story. You might well ask me, what does that have to do with Vayakhel? How does that have to do with the Parsha? Why are you giving me some history lesson here? Although I have your attention more than I did before, which is good. The answer is that Rabbi Soloveitchik in turn quoted one of his ancestors, someone by the name of Rabbi Chaim, usually then they didn't have last names, of Volozhin. Volozhin was the name of a city in Lithuania, Poland. It actually was the prototype, it was the first of the modern day yeshiva. Used to be up until that time that people almost never left town to go to a yeshiva. There was some type of educational institution. One could study Jewish religious texts in the community. Every community had it, regardless of size. You studied there. If a person reached a certain level of scholarship, wanted to go apprentice under a great rabbi, so he went to that city. It was no formal system. Volozhin was the first yeshiva. Okay, was started. He was. I mentioned this before. He was started, and his rabbi approved as rabbi. Someone by the name of Rabbi Elijah Vilna, known as the Vilna Gaon, who happened to be my wife's great grandfather. Nepotism will get you far. So anyway, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Volozhin, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, the following story happened. When he started his yeshiva, it was an innovation that time. He sent people known in Hebrew as Meshulachim. People would go out to collect fundraisers, right, to various communities. Okay? Got to a certain community, a certain small community, and this individual, and this is a community where no one was known to be wealthy, everyone was of modest means. This individual gave a very, very, very generous contribution every year. Every year, all right? One year, the person who was in charge of the collecting, there weren't that many people that had, the fundraiser, came to Rabbi Chaim and said, Rabbi Chaim, he said, I think we can make things more efficient. He said, as it is now, I don't have an assistant, I don't have, a wagon or any horses. I've got to wait for a ride to here and wait for a ride to there, and who knows when the stagecoach is leaving. It was called that, but I'm using that imagery because it resonates with me, right? And what I would like to do is propose is, if you can get me a horse and buggy and someone to, a rider, a driver, I think that things will be more efficient. Rabbi Chaim agreed, and this fundraiser went off to the community. Well, he came to the same community where this individual had been given money since the time the yeshiva was founded, which was, I don't know how many years, like 10 years, something like that, and he wouldn't give him a penny. came back. Rabbi Chaim then was, concerned, with everyone, not only in the sense that, he needed money for the bottom line, but also with the connection people would have with his school, with his yeshiva, and talked about this individual, and the fundraiser said, he just stopped giving me money. So Rabbi Chaim, the great Rabbi Chaim, at the next available moment, which is a few months later, he asked this fundraiser to bring him to that individual. When it comes to that individual, again, if you can try to imagine, a politician, I don't know, a state senator or a governor or someone like that, who goes to some hick town out the way, it's very unusual. And this former contributor couldn't believe it. He said, Rabbi Chaim, why, I'm honored to have you. And Rabbi Chaim said, why are you not giving me money? So you know what the answer is? Those who have been involved in raising money can imagine. I want to give money for the yeshiva. I don't want to give money for your horses. I don't give money for your wagon. I don't want to give money, for the driver, all those. I don't want to do that. So Rabbi Chaim said to him, let's learn a little bit of Torah. I don't know if this was the portion that week or not. That I don't know. And he showed him this verse that I quoted. Betzalel was filled with godly spirit, wisdom, mystical, understands and all that. And in addition to that, oh boy, could he work with gold and silver and copper. He said, it's an embarrassment. This is Rabbi Chaim asking the question. He says, as if you were to say about a great scholar, right? Jewish or secular, right? That this guy is a great scholar, and you know what? He's a mean tailor too. Now, I don't know enough about tailoring. I know some of my ancestors were tailors, but I have the impression that was not necessarily, the high-end, prestigious position back then. So Rabbi Chaim said, you know what? He said, that's not the point of the verse here. The point of the verse is not that Betzalel knew how to fashion things, with gold and silver and copper, but rather, because of his divine wisdom, Betzalel was able to understand through meeting the people that contributed to him what their thoughts were. This is an individual that is so filled with that religious zeal we spoke about before, that every last penny of his contribution has to go towards the tabernacle, right? Here's another individual who's, is certainly committed, but not necessarily committed to that extent. Some of his funds can go towards something of, somewhat of a less direct connection to the tabernacle, and so on and so forth. And Rabbi Chaim said, listen, no one these days, in his time, this is by the way in the 1800s, right? No one in our days has this divine wisdom that Betzalel has, but there is a God in heaven, and I assure you that if you contribute to my yeshiva, to my school, right, and you intend that every last penny of every last amount that should go to the students, to those who are studying Torah, to the instructors, and not to all these, I don't call them incidentals because they're not, they were important things, right? Not to the horse and buggy and driver, then that will happen as well. That's an example of the type of wisdom, I'm getting back to our portion that we're talking about here, that Betzalel had. That's an example of, something that I guess in some ways maybe is a little, I don't know if we always think in these terms, When we talk about giving charity, and this is not an appeal today, by the way, we'll do that soon, but not today, right? It's not an appeal, but the point is that when we talk about contributions in Jewish tradition, yes, the contributions are important, but in some ways as important, and in some ways perhaps even more important, is the intention that goes with it. The intention that goes with it. Is it to create a sanctuary for God? Is it to ensure a sense of Jewish identity and Jewish education and Jewish continuity or whatever? All of these are the important lessons I think we learned from this week's portion. So again, just to summarize, we learned about the importance of the Sabbath. That Sabbath represents a time and place, a sanctuary, right, for us every week. We don't have that physical sanctuary, either the tabernacle or the temple anymore. But God, through history, has shown us that in some ways, this tabernacle we create in time, this weekly tabernacle of the Sabbath, is more important for us. And, I urge us all to, whatever appropriate ways, incorporate into our lives. We learned about the importance of sometimes, again, within, appropriate guidelines, that we have to allow our inspired self to lead the way, and not always think in terms of pragmatics, not always think in terms of pluses or minuses, is this going to help me, is this going to hurt me, etc., right? And we finally learned this story that, hopefully I was clear in retelling about how important it is to have the right intention in giving to worthy causes. And once that happens, then God, of course, will work his magic to make sure that our efforts are crowned with success. That's it for me. Any questions? All right, Shabbat Shalom. I went a little bit over time today. Sorry.